It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
Well, hello, everyone. It's not Kyle today. It's just me, Andrea, and my really awesome guest hosts, Cindy Black, our executive director here at Redeemer Radio, and Catherine Yanko, who you're probably familiar with from Thursdays during the summer, but we're switching it to Wednesday today. Welcome, guys. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Well, today we thought we would spend some time talking about women in the church, some of our own reflections on our experiences as women in the church, what we've learned as Catholic women at different stages in our lives, and then we're going to talk about some Catholic women we admire, including a game I made with some fun stories about Catholic women that I'm just really excited to talk about because they're awesome. But first, as usual, let's start with a prayer. Cindy, do you want to lead us in prayer?
Yes, this is actually from Catherine's namesake, her patron, Catherine of Siena. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Eternal God, eternal Trinity, you have made the blood of Christ so precious through his sharing in your divine nature. You are a mystery as deep as the sea. The more I search, the more I find. The more I find, the more I search for you. But I can never be satisfied. What I receive will ever leave me desiring more. When you fill my soul, I have an ever greater hunger, and I grow more famished for your light. I desire above all to see you, the true light, as you really are. Amen. In the name of the Father, and Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Usually we have a joke on Wednesdays, but I was so excited about our game that I didn't find a joke. Do you guys have a joke? Anybody know any jokes? I feel like this is really a dad thing. The dad jokes is really Kyle's specialty, but I'm not good at jokes. I'm more of a situational humor kind of person.
I think that's the same for me too. I can never remember jokes. Even when I hear a good one that's appropriate, I think I'm going to remember that, and then I don't.
Yeah, there's a well-known story in our family of me trying to tell the "Orange, you glad I didn't say banana" joke, but getting it wrong and starting with orange instead of banana, and
didn't work out.
My father-in-law still teases me about that. I'm pretty bad at jokes, but that's okay. So we'll just skip the jokes unless someone wants to send us a joke. You can send it to us. Holy Cross College text line 260-436-9598. And while you're at it, you can send us your answer to today's Tri-Bond. We're going to do Tri-Bond today. I don't even remember what the Tri-Bond was last week, so I'm not going to give you the answer like Kyle usually does, but we are going to have a Tri-Bond for today. So these are three things that have one thing in common: Siena, Calcutta, and Assisi. So if you know the answer, you can email show@redeemerradio.com, or you could call and leave a message or send a text to the Holy Cross College text line 260-436-9598. Again, the Tri-Bond today, three things, one thing in common: Siena, Calcutta, and Assisi. And if you heard us talk about the theme, that might be just, an enormous hint. So anyway, a few things we haven't actually had our normal sort of news catch-up kind of opening segment in a few days since Kyle's gone this week. And we had our really fun guest hosts, Ken and Bill, yesterday, and a best of on Monday. We've got more plans for the rest of the week, but just catching up on a few things. I wanted to let everyone know, if you haven't heard yet about our Italy Odyssey coming up next fall, you should know now. I'm telling you. Also, if you want to know lots more about it, August 30th, we're going to have a presentation on that trip. So basically, they're going to be traveling to a bunch of the highlights of Italy. Honestly, so Rome, of course, is where they'll start and end the trip. But also, they're going to stop in Monte Cassino, where St. Benedict founded his first monastery. San Giovanni Rotondo, which is where Padre Pio lived. Assisi, of course, where St. Francis was. Siena, which I think we're going to talk about later. Florence, a bunch of places that are just going to be so awesome on this trip. And another special highlight, Father Tom Shoemaker is going, which is going to be so awesome. I don't know if you guys listened to our Flavor of the Week with Father Tom, but he is a remarkably well-traveled man.
Yes.
And I think it would be amazing to go on a trip with him, because he would just be like a tour guide himself, but also he's a spiritual tour guide and leader. It's going to be so awesome.
He's very adventurous in his travels. Now, he's going to have to sacrifice by sleeping in actual nice hotels and eating in restaurants.
This is kind of going to be like a tame, sort of like a luxurious trip for him. But it's going to be awesome. So if you want to find out more information already, you can just go to redeemerradio.com/travel. But again, there also is going to be this informational presentation on August 30th. You can either be in Fort Wayne or at our South Bend studio for that. The Fort Wayne meeting will be at St. Charles, and the South Bend meeting will be at our studios at Little Flower Parish. So that's August 30th, and you can find more information at redeemerradio.com/travel. Another thing I wanted to touch on in the church news, Pope Francis has accepted the resignation from the College of Cardinals of Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. He's the retired Archbishop of Washington, and he's been ordered to maintain a life of prayer and penance until a canonical trial examines some allegations about sexually abusing minors. Earlier this summer, some news came out that he'd been accused of sort of decades worth of sexual misconduct with adults, but now there are these allegations, at least 2 so far, of improprieties and abuse with minors as well. That's kind of all the facts of the case as we know them right now. It's definitely a situation where we know that prayer is needed. Prayers for the people who have suffered, prayers for the church in general, prayers for the leaders of the church who are facing sort of the consequences of how they maybe have handled this, but also the people who are having to handle it now, who are going to have to be making the decisions going forward. So please keep all that in your prayers, and we'll keep you posted on that story too. But if you're looking for some good news, I have some of that too. For those of you who are altar servers or parents of altar servers, Pope Francis had some words of encouragement yesterday, focusing on how young people can be a great example of holiness in the world. But he noted that holiness is not for the lazy. So I feel like as summer sort of wanes, this might be a speech you want to send to your children. Just a little note for your parents, a few parents out there, a good refresher for school starting. Also, check out photos of the Tour de France riders praying at Lourdes over the weekend. Their route takes them past Lourdes, and they're just all these really cool photos of their uniforms and like carrying their helmets around and lighting candles at Lourdes. And so if you're a sports fan or just a fan of seeing people living the faith in unusual circumstances, go ahead and Google that. That'll look fun too. So we are going to be back in the next segment talking about what it's like to be a woman in the church, what we know about from our own experiences, and also from what we learned about the church's teachings here on The Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
We'd like to thank you for listening to the show and also invite you to follow us on social media. We are at Redeemer Radio on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We always like to share different things that we find inspirational, as well as past shows whenever they're available, maybe give you a hint on what's coming up on different shows. So follow us and also share things on social media. It's a great way to share the faith with your friends by sharing things that Redeemer Radio posts. So go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and follow Redeemer Radio.
Welcome back, and thanks for listening to us on Redeemer Radio. This is the Kyle Hyman Show, but Kyle is on vacation this week, so I am sort of quasi-hosting Andrea Serrani, usually the sidekick, but I decided to take it over today. I'm here with Cindy Black, our executive director here at Redeemer Radio, and our good friend of the show, Catherine Yanko. Thanks, guys, for coming. So I sort of introduced this topic in the first segment where, since we're all women, Catholic women, we decided to talk about Catholic women on the show today, our one area of expertise. But we did decide to talk about that. We talked about fatherhood on Theology of the Body Thursday a week or two ago, so we'll talk about women this week.
And actually, we have close to 100 years experience of being women, and I'm half of that.
Yes, if you combine us, we get quite close to, I think, right around that 100-year mark. So we normally do Theology of the Body on Thursdays, but Wednesdays work too. And I think...
Wednesday, womanhood. There
Women Wednesday.
Women
I love
Wednesday.
it. It's perfect. So we talk about this a little bit in Theology of the Body. We've talked about a little bit. This is something we talk about constantly in Theology of the Body, actually. But in the context of our conversation today, Cindy, do you want to talk a little bit about complementarity and how how that relates to what the church teaches about women, and then we'll sort of springboard off of that into our conversation.
Yeah, well, if we look back at creation, that God creates us male and female, and Adam's first experience with that is he recognizes a sameness in Eve, but then a very differentness. So I think as we have our conversation about what it's like to be women, this is just meant to highlight the unique way of being that the three of us share, and that 51% of the population shares, not to disparage masculinity at all, but to highlight our experience of femininity, which is unique and different in and of itself, that within masculinity and femininity, there's infinite numbers of expression of what that means, and there's beauty in every expression of that.
Yeah, and this can be kind of a sort of a controversial topic when you're talking about it sort of in broader circles or secular circles, just even the idea of complementarity or there being inherent difference between male and female. But it's something that I have found even just in my sort of younger life as a woman that is so important for us to acknowledge and really try to understand as well as we can. And like you said, in our uniqueness as individuals, but also sort of in the whole as women, especially because of the way that the sort of secular world denies it. I grew up kind of like with a little bit of a feminist bent because that's how my mom grew up, and that's how, she has this kind of woman hear me roar, which I really admire about her. But without sort of understanding it as I grew up with sort of the church's wisdom, it can kind of fall into this, I am woman, hear me roar, because I'm just like a man.
Right.
Which I think is just such an impoverished version of understanding ourselves as women. And the more I encounter sort of that secular feminist version of what it means to be powerful or have authority or control or however they want to see it, it really does just look to me like power to them is really just being exactly like a man, being able to do all the same things and think all the same ways and all those kinds of things, which is fine as far as it goes if all you care about is capability. But there's so much more to being a woman than that. And the more that I've come to understand that, the more I have appreciated myself as a woman, but also appreciated the way that the church views women, I think, too.
I love the point that you made, Cindy, about the infinite diversity and the infinite uniqueness that women have. And just, I think it's when I start and view my own femininity with that perspective of this is so different than anyone else's. This is my femininity, but there is something so similar that we, us three here, share. The same thing goes for complementarity then too. There's infinite ways that, in my uniqueness that I can relate to men. And does that have, is there a certain framework kind of thing for that? The same way that we share femininity, yes, but there is room for a lot of application here. The same then is said of masculinity, and it just, I think when you have that freedom and that creativity, and that's when you see it to be able to be the most life-giving, and the least, I feel the least need to say I'm a woman, hear me roar, because I'm being respected for who I am, for my dignity as a person with my individual subjectivity, able to do what it's called to.
Yeah, right. Something that my husband and I talked about during our marriage preparation was, and I think this sort of broad, it applies in a very specific way to marriages, but I think we can kind of see it as the way that it applies to masculinity and femininity more generally, is the way that St. Paul describes women being obedient to their husbands, but men loving their wives in the way that Christ loves the church. And my husband and I were talking about that and reflecting on the way that those two things can't be without each other, that that authority that a man would have only comes because of his sacrifice, because of how much he loves, that the only reason a woman would be obedient to him is because she can trust that he loves her. And I sort of think of that. I sort of think of that in a way that it's applied sort of to the church and sort of the hierarchical nature of it. That's a way that I've sort of framed that in my mind to try to explain to people sometimes about well, why can't there be women priests or things like that? And there is the answer of, well, because Jesus made that way. And that's good enough for me. but it's more than that too. It's that just the priesthood is power, right? It's that the priesthood is responsibility. It's this sacrifice, and that my trust in that is because of my trust in that sacrifice and that real love. And so that's one thing that has helped me sort of view my own place as woman, and that obedience is not less. That obedience is trust.
Right. And I think another word that can help us with that is like submission. Like instead of fighting against the male laying down of his life, submitting and allowing him to. And in that, there's this beautiful reciprocity of mutual self-gift that I think in the marriage is exemplified, but also in other situations as well, that notion of being built up by laying down each other's lives.
Yeah, exactly. So what would you say if someone asks you, like, what do you most, I'm going to ask you, not just someone, I'm going to ask you, what do you most want women to know about themselves? Either in the context of what do you want Catholic women to know about themselves that maybe you find that they misunderstand a lot, or even just women more broadly speaking, even within the secular world, that maybe the church can give them. And like, I love the way that Catherine, you talked about it as life-giving, because I really think that is what the church gives us, is a life-giving version of ourselves.
Well, I like to defer to experts that are way more intelligent and holy than me. One of my favorite quotes about being a woman is from Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, and that's, "The woman's soul is fashioned as a shelter in which other souls may unfold." And it really speaks to how women have an incredible capacity for others, for not just looking at like systems, and not that we don't care about systems and efficiency and things like that, but we have a unique way of being able to see the whole and embrace the whole. And there's like that sense of nourishment that does help foster the uniqueness of and beauty of each other person that we interact with.
Man, I'm going to have to bank that quote, because that I think sort of along those same lines is what I have found, both that I want women to know, but also that I have actually had the experience of like trying to explain to someone and seeing it, like the light bulb go off in this, she was like 45 when I had this conversation with her, and her just realizing how much that understanding of herself could change. And so what I think I would say is something along the lines of that motherhood is for every woman, even if it's not through having children, even if it's not a physical motherhood. The woman that I was speaking with, she wasn't Catholic, but she worked at the Catholic school where I was working, and she had been married, but they hadn't had any children. And she was talking about, she had this sort of innate desire for loving people in that way, that whole way that you were just talking about, Cindy. And I said, well, you can love people like that even if you don't have children. And she had never thought of herself that way. She had never thought of herself as giving that kind of love, even though she had tried to and she had desired it. She had never thought of that. And I think that's something that's so beautiful about the way that the church talks about motherhood and spiritual motherhood, especially like John Paul II in Theology of the Body talks about this, and the way that the woman's heart is designed for love in that special way. So that's something that, like, I think it's really good for women to explore about themselves, whether they are single and have never been married and just aren't at the phase of motherhood yet, how they can love people with that mother's heart. And then mothers who have actual children, physical children who are in various different phases, like how you are loving your own children, but also the people around you. And then, even older women who either haven't had children or their children are grown, just the ways that we can embrace the special sort of power of maternal love that God gives us in our femininity, and how that can really affect people.
I think sometimes it can be a challenge to just see. I like how you brought up the priesthood earlier, and sometimes, at least for me, especially I'm 22, so like growing up in the culture that we do, been interesting to not see spiritual fatherhood as an obstacle to like my own spiritual motherhood or my expressions of my femininity. But I just remember one time like reading the Gospels, and yes, like Jesus made the priesthood for men, but then he says like, and these women were following close behind. And then, you know, if you think about that and what that would actually look like, it's the woman in the crowd with all the people that are coming and converting. And it's not like, I can't imagine them just sitting there not talking, like a group of women just not talking. That's not where does that happen?
Realistic.
Yeah, but I think that, I don't know, like that mystery there of just, you know, the woman talking to everyone on the fringes and to the woman inviting them into communion that Jesus is providing for them. And, you know, of course, like the guys who are writing the Gospels aren't necessarily going to be able to detail that the way that they do their priestly service. But does that mean that it didn't happen? No.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, that's just such a good model, I think, for me as a woman in the church of this is my femininity and it does not have to look like the priesthood. And that's okay. Like it can have a very different shape, but we can be working together to bring everyone into communion.
Yeah, right. Like it brought to mind at Redeemer Radio, we've sort of simplified our mission. Sometimes we just say we're trying to make Christ known to people. And sort of sometimes I think like, well, duh, like, isn't that everyone's job all the time? But also that is everyone's job all the time. And as Christians, and so making Christ known to people really is what living the Christian life boils down to. And if we're doing that in a special way as women, then like we're doing what God designed us for. And that's a really cool thing. So stick around. We're going to talk about some really cool women saints who have had a big effect on the church next in a little game we made. So we'll be back on the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
Just a reminder, you can listen to Redeemer Radio live no matter where you are. Of course, we've got 95.7 FM Michiana and 106.3 FM Northeast Indiana. But also, if you're outside of those listening areas or don't have good reception where you are, you can always listen online. You can stream at redeemerradio.com and stream live there or through the Redeemer Radio app. There is a live streaming function in the app. So wherever you are, you can stream Redeemer Radio and share that with your friends.
This is the Kyle Hyman Show, but this isn't Kyle. He is on vacation this week, and so I am Andrea Serrani filling in for him for today, along with Cindy Black, our executive director here at Redeemer Radio, and friend of the Kyle Hyman Show, Catherine Yanko. Thanks again, guys, for being with us. We're halfway through. We made it so far. So in this segment, we're going to do a really fun game about women saints and their really cool stories. But first, we have Tribon today. We haven't in a few days, so for our faithful Tribon players, this is for you. Tribon today, 3 things that have one thing in common: Sienna, Calcutta, and Assisi. If you know the answer, you can send it to show@redeemerradio.com, or you can call or text 260-436-9598. That's the Holy Cross College text line. Again, the Tribond, Sienna, Calcutta, Assisi. And if you pay attention and stay tuned for this game, you'll probably know the answer. That's your big hint. Okay, so in this game, I'm going to tell you the story of a woman saint, and you're going to tell me who that woman saint is. And this game was not designed to be hard. It was just designed to be inspiring. So,
Good.
let's hear about some cool holy ladies. Okay, first one. You might call this woman the most important woman of all time. You might say that. She was an only child born to elderly Jewish parents. She grew up to be a pretty typical wife and mother in ancient Israel with a few pretty major exceptions. First, she never sinned. Second, her son's father was God himself, and she eventually had to watch that son die for the sins of the entire history of humankind.
Our Blessed Mother.
This is Mary, right? This is Mary, Mother of God, Blessed Mother. She has about 1,000 names, and she deserves them all. I don't think greatest woman of all time is an overstatement. Nope. Okay, next one. This woman was famously trusting of God's providence to help in her mission to serve the poor. Here is my personal favorite story of her extreme trust. In the early 1980s, Beirut was being bombarded, and this holy woman arrived in neighboring Lebanon. She found out there was a hospital full of handicapped children stuck in the crossfire. Despite protestations from local priests, police officers, and even the U.S. ambassador, she insisted on being allowed into the war zone to rescue them. Here's how the conversation went. But do you hear the bombs? Yes, I hear them. It is absolutely impossible to cross at the moment. We must obtain a ceasefire. But I asked Our Lady in prayer. I asked for a ceasefire for tomorrow, the eve of her feast day. Mother, I am more than happy to have a woman of prayer at my side. I believe in the power of prayer. I believe that prayer is answered. I'm a man of faith, but you see, you're asking Our Lady to deal with the Prime Minister. And do you not think that the time limit you gave him is a little short? You should extend it a little? No, not at all, Minister. I'm sure we'll have a ceasefire tomorrow. And there was.
Mother Teresa.
This is Mother Teresa. There's actual
I didn't know that story.
Yeah,
There's
it's my favorite
actual
one.
video footage of her having this conversation with these men in this room.
Guess what I'm doing at 8 o'clock?
Yeah, I have the documentary. I'll bring it to you. Yeah, amazing. She literally was like, no, I prayed that this will happen tomorrow. And they're like, well, can you pray for like a week? I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. And she's like, no, it's going to happen tomorrow.
Yep.
It did. And she saved like 100 little kids. Amazing. Okay. Next amazing woman. This woman was an Italian Dominican nun. At one point, she was engaged to be married, but she had a vision of St. Dominic while she was very ill. And when she made a full recovery, she decided to become a Dominican herself. She wrote countless letters to both secular and religious leaders, encouraging them to pursue justice and holiness. During a time when the papacy had been moved away from Rome into France, she wrote letter after letter trying to convince the Pope to return. And eventually he did. After that Pope died, she dedicated herself to helping resolve a conflict over political tensions during the election of the next Pope. And despite all of her involvement in these affairs of men, she also maintained strict dedication to a life of prayer and penances.
Catherine of Siena.
Catherine of Siena, that's right. She, I think we need a new Catherine today. Here you go, Catherine. This can be your new job, writing letters.
So many unsolicited opinions.
Exactly. Yes, she was definitely not afraid of making sure her opinions were known. And I really appreciate that about her. Okay, next one. Her visions of St. Michael the Archangel, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine of Alexandria led her to become a soldier to help during the French army win in battle against the English in the 100 Years' War.
St. Joan of Arc.
St. Joan of Arc. That's right. This saintly wife and mother suffered a lot from the men in her life. Her husband was a pagan and serial adulterer, and her beloved son followed his father's example of wayward living. But this holy mom prayed, and eventually her son converted and became one of the most important bishops and theologians in the entire history of the church.
St. Monica.
St. Monica. Her feast day is coming up this month. She's one of my favorites. I just think about like, man, if she
I don't
hadn't
know
been
very many
so,
Monicas either. That's a great name.
if she hadn't been so dedicated to prayer, like who knows if we would have ever had St. Augustine. Okay, this wealthy Italian woman met another great Italian saint during her travels and decided immediately to give up her possessions and start a women's version of his order devoted to extreme poverty and evangelization. Her rule of life for women was the first set of monastic guidelines known to have been written by a woman. And her feast day is next week.
Claire of Assisi.
Claire of Assisi. That's right. Although she was the youngest, she was the first member canonized from a saintly family. She was a Carmelite nun who wrote extensively about her spiritual life and how she encountered holiness in small, everyday sacrifices and opportunities to love. She also had a special commitment to prayer for the missionaries in the world, so much that she's one of the patron saints of missionaries, even though she never left her cloistered convent. Therese of Lisieux, that's right. First, but not only from her family. They're racking them up in the Martin family. This saint took a roundabout path to the faith. She was born a Jew but became an atheist before she became Catholic. She was a renowned philosopher and theologian. She wrote extensively on the role of women and feminism in the life of the church. We've even mentioned her already today. She turned down being a college professor and became a Carmelite nun instead, and eventually she was killed in Auschwitz in 1942.
Edith Stein.
Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. This woman used her power for good. She was an empress of the Roman Empire when Christianity was still not recognized as a legal religion. She converted to Christianity and convinced her son, the emperor, to stop the persecution of Christians and legalize Christianity throughout the empire. She also organized a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to recover the relics of the crucifixion.
I can't think of her. Constantine was her son.
Yep, Constantine's
and
mom.
She was...
Starts with an H. Helena. Yes, that's right. Okay, this woman was.
I forget about her. Oh my goodness!
know.
I gotta connect with
Without
her. A
her,
little bit
Christianity
The
might
ultimate
have.
scavenger hunt.
Yeah, I know. Okay, this woman is a hero of the pro-life movement. She was a working mom. She's another modern example of holiness. She was a doctor, wife, and mother of 4. When she was pregnant with her 4th child, she was diagnosed with a condition that put her life in danger, but she insisted on only allowing treatment that would keep her baby alive. the treatment did work, but she died from an infection shortly after her baby was born.
St. Gianna Molla.
St. Gianna Molla. That's right. So those are just some 10 examples of women whose holiness had a huge impact on the church. Amazing. I love women saints. So speaking of...
I was waiting for Felicity and Perpetua.
I know. Well, there are so many, so many good ones. Maybe we'll talk about them in the next segment.
Okay.
Because in the next segment, we're going to talk a little more about our experiences of being women in the church, this time through the lens of women we admire. So stick around here on The Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
If you're enjoying this episode, why not share it with a friend? You can just find the link for this show and share that on social media or tell somebody about it and invite other people to listen. A great way to share our faith is by sharing things that inspire us. So if this is helping you in your faith, we invite you to tell somebody about it.
This is the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio. I'm Andrea Serrani filling in for Kyle today while he's out on vacation this week. And I am joined by our executive director, Cindy Black, who you hear all the time on Theology of the Body Thursday, but it's Women Wednesday today. And we also have friend of the Kyle Hyman Show, Catherine Yanko here. Thanks for being here, guys. So if you have been listening all morning, you've been hearing lots about women in the church because it's Women Wednesday. And we talked a little bit earlier about sort of the church's teaching about women and how it's been important to us in our own understanding of ourselves as women. In the last segment, we played a really cool game where we heard some really cool stories about some really cool saints. And now we're going to talk some about the women who we have most admired in the church, whether they be saints or sort of more close to home women. So what about you, Cindy? Do you have somebody who comes to mind?
Well, just at the last minute, my grandmother came to mind because she really was the first faithful Catholic woman that I was close to. Mm-hmm. And I actually use her when I'm talking about theology of the body with young people. I talk about how she and my grandfather had never heard of theology of the body. They didn't know what we know, how St. John Paul II has explained it to the church, but they lived it. They lived that love-giving and life-giving, the unitive and procreative meaning of marriage, and that self-gift, and exemplified it in such a beautiful way. And I like to share the story of at my aunt's wedding when my grandma had breast cancer, and then I have a hard time saying this word, metastasized to the rest of her body. It was throughout her back. And my grandpa was dancing with her at the wedding, and just how tenderly he held her. And I knew that if he could take the cancer out of her and put it in himself, he would do it in a heartbeat. And that's kind of that's the role. I mean, that's how beautiful that self-giving, self-sacrificing love is that John Paul II talks about in the marital relationship. And so I hold up my grandma, just her dedication to praying the rosary and Mass and just the quiet, persevering faith. She wasn't a quiet woman, but her faith was a quiet faith.
I feel like that can be a way to describe a lot of women that I've encountered. But I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that gives me an opportunity to sort of explain why I think it's important for us to talk about sort of examples and to think about, for those of you who are listening, examples in your own life who have helped you understand yourself and your faith and yourself in light of your faith. Because I know all three of us have sort of a studious side, and we've all studied sort of the teachings of the church and the philosophy behind them and everything. But I think your grandma is the perfect example of that. You don't have to study those things to know what God wants of us and how he intends us to live. And for a lot of us, those lessons come most vividly through the people who live it around us. You know, you don't have to have read Theology of the Body or even listened to Cindy explain it to really understand what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman and what it means to love each other in light of those things. And we don't have to be biblical scholars to know and serve Jesus, you know, in the same way. So I think talking about these examples is such a cool way to think about how God reveals himself to us, and just to not take advantage or to take lightly those opportunities that he gives us to encounter him and learn about him in our own lives, and maybe an opportunity to say thank you to those people for being that example. for those of us who are doing this today, this exercise. So, Catherine, what about you? Do you have an example?
I think when I was a little kid, my mom gave us these like little books that had the stories of the saints in them, and they were just like little 2 paragraphs. But I just remember, I think that was super formative for me and growing up and like becoming a woman. Because when you read the stories, it's just, they're superheroes. So the things that they do, it's just, wow, like, are you kidding me? That's amazing. I think especially just the bravery that literally just exudes from them. You can't even imagine being in the room. So I always think of like Catherine of Alexandria and her bravery in the face of like her friends and family, just in choosing what God would want for her. I think the one that was coming to mind especially was Servant of God, Dorothy Day. He was like more modern, but there's like too many good stories. I don't even know. She started these Catholic worker homes to just provide, like you were saying in the opening segment, to provide a shelter for people to unfold and become themselves in. And I think so much, one of my favorite stories of her is she wrote her autobiography and she left all the hard parts out of her life. And then a couple years later, she realized, oh my gosh, I left everything that formed me out of my own autobiography. And so she rewrote it, and so it's the long loneliness. And I just think that the courage to be authentic and vulnerable is just so needed in the church. It just like, I don't know, she's a modern day Mary Magdalene, and that's a whole nother tangent to go on.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene is on my list of Catholic women I admire too. Yeah, and Dorothy Day is such a cool saint. I can't confirm right at this moment if Kyle has posted it yet, but if you listened to our show last Friday, those of you who are listening, we interviewed some people from the Catholic Worker House.
He was at the
South
Catholic.
Bend. Yeah,
he posted it.
Yeah, good.
Click that one.
He went and visited them last week while he was in South Bend, and just so beautiful to hear about the work that they do and how they were inspired by the founders of Catholic Worker, including Dorothy Day, and just kind of the impact that, and I think Dorothy Day is such a good example of the impact that a woman can have in just being a woman, just saying yes to the things that God asks her to do, and then see how the goodness that she agrees to do in her role can spread from there. And that's so cool. And one of the examples for me, and I purposely included this in our game because it's just such a cool story, is Mother Teresa. And her, just for me, her she has so many examples, of course, her just like total commitment to loving people, and but for me, her example is one of just having no fear. And whenever I sort of find myself worrying or thinking like this can't be possible, or how would this happen, or God, you can't be serious, like here are all the reasons that I can't do this or this can't work or whatever, I a lot of times will think about Mother Teresa and just her complete abandonment to say, if this is good and it's what God desires, then it's going to happen, and I'm going to make it happen, and no one's going to stand in my way, including bombs and the
heads of state.
Yeah, if you missed the story in the game, I told this story of Mother Teresa, who they were trying to talk her out of going into this bombed region to go into this hospital and get these little kids out of there, and she just kept saying, no, I have to go. And they said, but you can't, because no one can go, like none of us can go. And she just kept saying, well, but God wants me to, and I'm going to, like, I have to, and eventually God provided for her. And, there was the ceasefire that she prayed for. And I think about how much she trusted that would happen, and how many times throughout her work, over those decades, that she just trusted that if God wants us to do something, even if it's radical and even if it seems impossible, then he's going to make it possible. And that, I think that bravery is something that, we don't, I guess, typically think of as being womanly or feminine, but if you look at the examples of the saints, exactly like Catherine said, it might be a feminine version of bravery, but it's something so special and so important and makes such a huge difference for the people that they encounter. And I find it so inspiring, and try to keep it in my own mind, even when I'm doing stupid little things that are not even close to as impossible as going into a war-torn region to save children, but seem impossible to me at the time.
I love that story. It's so important, though, I don't know, like in my life, feel like knowing the stories of the saints and knowing where they came from and, their background and the huge choices like that they've made, it's so easy then when I get in my daily life, my routine, and I have anxiety about like an upcoming test or, issues in the family or, there's just daily life presents its own challenges. And when you start being able to recognize those and then, but this saint did this, like I can pray to them, I can seek to imitate them. And I think in that moment of seeking to imitate them, like there's a communion there. And it's not like the power of like, I'm not just alone anymore because there's this other woman saint who's done something similar to me. And that is life-giving too.
Right. And that we can have communion with them, that it's not just I'm remembering this story of this person who doesn't exist anymore, but that she can be present and really our advocate and intercessor for us.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
To help us become our unique form of who God created us to be.
For sure. Do you guys have any other examples of good examples who you've learned from?
Well, I really like Helen Alvarez. I'm always inspired when I hear her speak. And
she is, for those of you who don't know, she is a Catholic lawyer, a woman who she founded the Women Speak for Themselves sort of group, and she writes and speaks and does all kinds of things. So you can check her out online. She's amazing. Any other examples?
Lots of. Too
many to think of. One of the women who has been such a great example to me, and actually it made me think like, I really should reach out to her and say thank you for this because I don't know if I ever have. She was one of my professors in college, and her name is Maria Federica, and she honestly, when I said earlier in the show that I hadn't started to learn about sort of the uniqueness of femininity outside of the sort of I am woman, hear me roar dynamic. It was really a lot thanks to her, that her way of just describing womanhood and the reasons why behind church teaching and things like that I really, the light bulb really went off for me. And I still use to this day when I'm when I'm thinking about myself, but also especially when I'm talking to younger women about modesty, the way that she talks about the gift of our bodies and the way that we can honor ourselves and that kind of thing. I use so much of what she taught me to try to like help it sink in for other people I know. But she was just such a good example, and it was such a great thing for me to spend those years, even though I never even took a class with her. I only ever had, experience of her, but she would take her time out to give like little talks to the women in the dorms and things like that, or she'd give a theology on tap kind of presentation or something like that we would get to see. And it was such a gift for her to do that for us, to make sure that she was sharing her own wisdom with the women around her. And I know I was not the only one that she was so formative for. So yeah, she was a great example for me.
I think too, when I was in high school, during those formative years when you have women who aren't your mother in your life, not that your mothers are not great and lovely, but it can just be so pivotal, like you were saying with Dr. Federica. But for me, I remember in high school youth group, there was a woman who passed away a couple years ago, and her name was
just thinking,
Emily Weimer, and she was the first one that introduced me to communion with the saints by sharing her own experience with Saint Philomena, and she was just so beautiful. But she was not like early 30s, like single, not married, and coming and giving of her time to us every week, multiple times a week, and really just inviting us to like walk with her, and her impact on my life, and just that surrender of, even with her own illness and battling brain cancer, but even before like she was diagnosed, and just how she lived and loved us was incredible.
Yes. Emily, pray for us.
Yeah. So anyway, I hope that you have heard some great stories today. I hope we've encouraged you to think about some of the people in your own life who have been a good example of faith, and maybe you can reach out to them soon and let them know how formative they've been for you. Thanks for tuning in with us today here on the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio. Thanks to Notre Dame Federal Credit Union. And until next time, remember to leave room for the Holy Spirit.